Have you ever noticed a problem at work or saw a great opportunity? You brought it up, you had all the data to prove it, it was completely dismissed, maybe not even acknowledged, and then somebody else brought it up and it was suddenly a great idea? Or worse, you brought up a way to prevent a problem, they dismissed you, the problem happened, and then you got blamed for it? Or personal favorite, your boss asked you something, you answered it, and then they got upset? And maybe you were just so blunt or aggressive? If any of that is resonating in your body and mind right now, I need you to bear with me for the next few minutes because a recent shareholder analysis just gave us yet another piece of data on how these problems actually impact shareholder performance. And I know if you've been this person, you're probably like, I don't care about shareholder performance, but they do. And you learning this piece of evidence and how to portray it is needed to influence and make decisions. This recent shareholder analysis used a new method of collecting data to analyze the employee experience and look at how the Fortune 500 companies, how their employee experience relates to their stock performance. And places with a better employee experience, the top 20%, had 5% higher shareholder returns on the Fortune 500. 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but keep in mind, this is the Fortune 500. We are talking about trillions of dollars. So 5% is still billions of dollars in difference. That has to do with the employee experience. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Anna Kalschmidt. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. I research the unwritten rules of work for the working class and neurodivergence. I look at the parts of your job that nobody told you to do but are expected, and I also look at how those impact organizations. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the shareholder analysis, what it does say, what it doesn't say, and what my research can add to that. So this recent shareholder analysis was conducted by a company called Wellaba. And what they did was they used AI technology to scrape data from websites, 25 million data points from places like Glassdoor, Indeed, LinkedIn, etc. And this scraping allowed them to look at what people were really saying about their organizations and their experience. Now, a pro of this is that, as a lot of us know, when you do surveys within organizations, I've made a lot of them, you always run into the trust issue of, especially in really harmful organizations, people know I'm not going to submit to this anonymous survey. They very rarely believe it's anonymous. And I have been in the position of being the third-party consultant who has had to tell leaders, no, per our contract, I can only give you this data in aggregate. I cannot reveal individual people. Ethically, we're not supposed to, but of course, we know there are people who do it. So people are hesitant to say anything that could be identifying, even if reported in aggregate. Sometimes teams are really small, so they're like, no, it's going to be too identifiable. So a pro of this approach is that, similar to what I see in my comments on YouTube, TikTok, etc., people often have a fake name that they are saying things under, which has cons as well, and they're saying it with less of a filter because they're not going to be held accountable for it. Now, a con, and something Wellaba did not bring up in any of the reports I saw, was they don't tell you how they scanned for bots. Now, I don't see the point of why someone would troll as an organization, but maybe a competitor would. A pro of this approach is that while many places, like I used to work for a Big Four firm, we could show you people benchmarks of how their employee experience numbers ranked on average compared to their industry, but we couldn't show them actual competitors. Because these people are scraping from Glassdoor, Indeed, whatever, they can show actual numbers compared to competitors. And they call this method passive listening. Because people know when they're putting it online, anyone can see it, but they aren't exactly submitting to an authority where they know it's going to be used for this purpose. And interestingly, they said that a lot of employee experience surveys, when people do them in organizations, they are very similar across their competitors. Let's say you have an 80% score on your employee experience, that there's not as much usefulness that comes out of these because people just answer generically, or the people who do answer are the ones who are actually happy or aren't afraid of being identified because they have something positive to say, while the people who have something negative to say, while people are more likely to complain when they write a review and such. In an organization, that can be a little different because they can be afraid of the repercussions. But anyway, they stack ranked all of the Fortune 500, what they found across 25 million data points. And they found that the top 20% in financial returns were also the organizations that had 5% improved employee experience. Interestingly, the ones that were doing well had a lot in common, and the ones that weren't doing well had a lot more variety in the ways that things were going wrong. So a takeaway from this report was, don't worry about the ceiling. You got to establish the floor first. That was what the researchers said. I found that to be a hilarious analogy. And while there were many ways that things could go wrong, I think they looked at 26 dimensions. The one dimension that took up the largest share of the poorly performing companies compared to the top performers was that 56% of the ones not doing as well had poor bottom-up communication, meaning that the people at the top are not hearing communication from the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that's ironically costing the people at the top billions of dollars. But what Welleba's research cannot tell us is why, or what specific dynamics are going on there. That's where my research comes in. Bottom-up communication. So let's talk about my research on people who have moved from the bottom to the top. People who are from working class backgrounds, who have moved into middle class or higher via their employment. I've interviewed them, I've collected survey data, and the findings that I have found is that there are about 8 categories, 8 or 9 depending on how I group them, categories of unwritten rules that are never explicitly told you as you move up in your career. When you're handed a new job description, they're never written on them, but they are expected. And for these people who were successful, they had to at least know they existed. Most of them conformed somewhat. It was easier for white men to not conform, though not always. But most of them had to at least know they were there to know how to navigate them. And that's what I work on in my leadership workshops and with my coaching clients. I'll give you an example in a little bit. One of those unwritten rules is the unwritten rule of indirect communication, that you don't say anything directly and that you just handle it with kid gloves, sugarcoat it. There's some overlap here with corporate jargon of saying a whole lot of nothing. When I do leadership workshops, I do acknowledge that there is a certain level as you transition past middle management, though in middle management, again, they don't tell you this, but you should start being aware of this, that executives do think strategically and broadly. That's not inherently a bad thing. They are looking across an industry and trying to figure out what the next move is, what they need to be aware of. And so that broad language, if it is not filtered down into specific tangible tasks or explained well, then the boots on the ground are like, what are you talking about? Now that's top-down communication. This said bottom-up communication is the problem. Bottom-up, from the bottom where they're doing the entry-level, or not even entry-level, staff tangible work, are very rarely, especially if they're first-generation professionals, very rarely trained and know how to say what they're doing specifically impacts the broader strategic level. This is a failure of learning and development. This is a failure of work culture. This is also because a lot of knowing how to do that is normalized in upper middle class households and higher. These are things that people just expect you to know how to do that aren't explicitly told. And so if you don't know the connection between the broad strategic objectives and how your tangible tasks tie to that, then you're going to come across as less competent. And your work is going to feel less meaningful because you're not seeing how it actually does anything. A lot of people whose parents did manual labor struggle to see the value of their own white-collar work, even if they feel very privileged doing it and enjoy it, because they're like, my dad built a house, what am I doing? And that's where having an understanding of the strategy and how it applies not only enhances your career, but can enhance you seeing the task meaningfulness. So this can be a barrier for people of learning how to convey from the bottom to the top the meaningfulness of their task, which also puts their task at risk during things like layoffs. Part of why we see a lot of C-suites making decisions about AI that then they're like, oh shit, we have to bring people back. I didn't know they did all that. Or it's intentional and they wanted to pay less. Again, it all happens, right? It's hard to assign intent to everyone. But there's also just a class cultural code of that even if your work is tangible and you understand their strategic objectives, that they're still expecting you to speak very indirectly. And that is more common in very upper middle class white households in the US as opposed to a lot of other households, especially in the working class. If you've grown up with people who are very literal and said what they mean, throw in neurodivergence in there, It's very difficult to speak and grasp these abstract languages that are a different dialect, really, in a class culture code. A lot of people from working class backgrounds are told they're too blunt, they're too aggressive, too direct. A lot of that is differences in class culture. Working class in the US has a lot of authoritarianism. There is a lot of expectation of obedience. Working class kids are raised to obey. Their parents are not their friends. They're not pretending to be. They are raising them to be in blue-collar jobs where they will not have a lot of power and they will have to obey to be employed. And that they may be in less safe neighborhoods where they do not want them running in the road. They may or may not have a yard with a fence. All of these things, I don't say that as a negative way about the parents. They are raising them to survive in that environment. That's very different from the example I've given of watching Succession, where you see those adult children don't take no for an answer. And that starts very early in richer households of those kids are raised to negotiate. And working class parents see that as very disrespectful and disobedient. While the wealthy, who very often don't raise their own kids by themselves, they have nannies and other support, are raising them to know to challenge authority because they expect them to be an authority. And that can also be an issue for people from working class backgrounds, especially if they're also women, on even knowing what an option is to negotiate. Shit, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but while we're talking about a Succession reference, let's also talk about a recent show that's gotten a lot of attention. Margot's Got Money Troubles, okay? Seen it, it's about, they say at one point, it's a white trash family. And I, having grown up around a lot of substance abuse myself, there were a lot of characters that it makes me tear up a little bit thinking about it, to be honest. But I really enjoyed the book, and the show isn't as good as the book, but it's still really good. If you haven't seen the show, the premise is a 19-year-old girl who's first generation going to community college gets knocked up by her college professor who's from a wealthy family, and he wants no involvement with her at all, and she still has the baby. At one point, his mother tries to get her to sign an NDA so that she doesn't ruin his life. And she gets her to sign an NDA for, in the book, it was $15,000 immediately, and then $50,000 put in a trust for her child that will eventually projected to become $300K by the time he's 18. She signs the NDA. She doesn't even know that she could have negotiated. And I realize that's not a workplace example, but for me, what really stands out, and in the book she says this, they don't say this in the show. In the book she says, it's like she's writing retrospectively, I didn't realize that I could have asked for a lot more and how much I was being taken advantage of. Because she's, $15,000 right now. This is a woman who's just lost her job because she can't get childcare. The whole premise of the show is this is how she gets into sex work. And this is why a lot of women get into sex work, because they've been cut off from other options, and that's what she can do. She's 19, and the NDA bans her from going to that college. All of these things, but she doesn't realize with how rich that family is and with how much power she has, and that they are so afraid his wife is going to find out, or that the college will find out because he was her professor and he's in his 30s, that she could have asked for way more. She could have said, I'm not signing shit till it's $1 million or more. I don't even know how wealthy the family was, but she signs it. And so when you don't even know the rules of the game, you get screwed. And a lot of people have a hard time even acknowledging and learning the rules of the game and say, I'm not even going to do that because it's wrong. And I love the focus on fairness. I do. And yet, you cannot win a battle by pretending the other side doesn't have weapons. You at least need to know what they are so you don't step on the landmines. And yes, I realize the irony of using the war example when it's very annoying how much corporate America uses war examples. But, maybe that'll resonate. So anyway, knowing these unwritten rules is very important for bottom-up communication, and that communication is one of them. Indirect communication is an unwritten rule that's very telling. In my book, I mentioned that Grammarly did a report in 2024 that estimates that miscommunication costs companies $1.2 trillion with a T dollars per year. Axios did another one that estimates it actually costs them $2 trillion with a T. And I could not find their methodologies. I was curious. And I even wrote in the book, if you work at one of those companies and you want to talk data, hit me up. I just want to talk. But let's go with the conservative estimate of $1.2 trillion. That is still 2.5 times more than companies paid in taxes in 2024. Because trillions are really hard to conceptualize because it's such an insane amount of money. But I've never met a business leader who doesn't know that they have communication problems. And I've never met a business leader who isn't trying to reduce what they pay in taxes. And yet, when you talk about having clearer communication, people being more direct and not being penalized, etc., and I'm not saying being mean, there's a difference between direct and mean, very few want to do anything about that. So, let that show you, the Grammarly report, the Axios, etc., that what Wellaba is showing us isn't groundbreaking. We have known for a long time that treating people like shit, as I always say, being an asshole costs you money. Miscommunication costs you money. We know this, but it's another way to look at it, and that they can get more specific with comparing competitors. Now, another unwritten rule here that is really a big issue is what I call the unwritten rule of compliance. It's when there's the appearance of that they're asking for your opinion or your expertise, but they're not really. I think of it as the opposite of psychological safety, but it can be confusing because it's the appearance of something. They're not saying, oh, don't do this, oh, don't disagree. They're saying, oh, what's your opinion? Oh my God, that was just so blunt. This is one of the most dangerous unwritten rules. So in my book chapter on this, of course, I give the Boeing example because they're just such a tangible example of this. Anything that leads to a whistleblower, they had the unwritten rule of compliance, where people spoke up and they were placed as the problem. I also give the example of the OceanGate disaster. You know how many people told that CEO, your device isn't ready, the submersible isn't certified, please don't kill people? And then him and 4 other people got killed? And I say in the book, the only thing unusual about that situation was that the billionaires had to deal with the consequences of that. That it actually wasn't working class bodies that died, because it usually is. If the Boeing disasters were happening to private jets, do you think that we'd still have these problems? And not all situations like this are life and death. You sometimes just have really stupid, poor business decisions made. And I always think of this unwritten rule when I see things that make it into mainstream that everybody says, how did they not know that would be a bad idea? So let's think of the recent Nike ad, okay? Not a life or death situation. They had the ad that said, walkers tolerated, right? Runners welcome, walkers tolerated. People were pissed. And people, how would you think that would be a good idea? Why did nobody say anything? They could have, and they were dismissed, or they weren't allowed to. All these commencement speeches we're seeing of people talking about AI without acknowledging that the people graduating are having to deal with unemployment and navigating AI replacements in the job market. How did nobody tell them? Why don't they understand this? There were likely people who did and they dismissed it, or they couldn't. This is the unwritten rule of compliance. And some of it's so blatant at some point you have to just think that some of them have humiliation kinks, because you'd think that for at least self-preservation and no embarrassment, they'd want feedback before being put on the stage of the world. And this is where the Wellaba study is also valuable, because even with that humiliation kink, honey, it's showing that you're losing money. If bottom-up communication, if over half of the companies that aren't performing as well as their competitors are because people can't communicate from bottom to top, the unwritten rule of compliance is absolutely applying here. It could be that people struggle to understand your strategy. It could be that they don't know how to convey it, but it could also be that they're not allowed to, and if they are punished. And these unwritten rules, indirect communication, compliance, and the other 6, they are not distributed equally. Like I said, in my research, I have found that everyone picked up on these unwritten rules. Okay, not everyone, but like 80%. All of them picked up on them, knew they were there. White men disproportionately were like, I may or may not do them. Not always, and it depended on the rule. But women, people of color, women of color, there's no getting around them. Most of the Black women I have interviewed have become entrepreneurs because it never went away. But the higher I got up, the more I was under a microscope. So I have interviewed many Black women who became executives in the federal government or corporate. Badasses. Made it. Fortune 500. Top SES in the government. And they were like, yeah, I'm going to do my own thing. And they became the competitors of that business and run successful businesses because they just needed a break from these unwritten rules. They needed to be able to speak freely, to use their expertise. A lot of the white women I've interviewed had to adhere up to a point, and then they had a little more freedom. Never total freedom, but a little more freedom. And unfortunately, I've talked to a lot of people who talk about how their white woman boss then became the bully. And that's many other videos I've made, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But remember, the premise of my research is on working class identities in social class. And so these are inherently disproportionately impacting people whose parents weren't professionals, who they can't call to say, oh, that means this, or say it this way, or don't worry about that, that's not a big problem, or you need to negotiate there. So unwritten rules abound and impact the organization as a whole. Some people know them, some people don't, some people they impact more. Let me tell you about two of my coaching clients who have experienced this directly. So I had one coaching client, working class woman, Southern woman, who her boss did explicitly tell her, he was all, I don't want you to disagree with me. I think we should all work in silos. And he told her he just essentially wanted her to operate like she was driving with cruise control. And the company was in a really serious situation. And she was like, this is the biggest load of bullshit I've ever heard. Because she had ideas, she had solutions, and she kept running into, he very much saw her as a threat. And he was afraid of not being the idea guy. And I've made a lot of videos about how that's what white collar really rewards, is the ideas. And so you can run into this tango, this push and pull of you're expected to do the work. And you should come up with ideas, but then you're a threat if you have good ideas. And so what I worked on with that client in coaching was how can we demonstrate her value, because she was up for an executive promotion, demonstrate her value, show she's an idea person, and not completely roll over. And what we worked on with her was showing him that she was on his side, that she wasn't there to replace him, that she wasn't combating him, that they could share the load, and on packaging her ideas in a way that was less threatening, but still impactful. And yes, I know, fairness burgers, I'm with you. She shouldn't have to. There's absolutely sexism in there. It is energy. It is exhausting. And that's part of what I start with immediately. That is module 1 of my coaching program, is what are you willing to do? What are you not willing to do? What is worth your energy? What isn't? And how much of your job are we going to go ahead and allocate to you putting your energy and resources on these unwritten rules, on the office politics? Because if you don't see that as part of your job, which is very hard, again, for people who are from manual labor to do, is to see this as a job, you are going to burn out because you're going to be giving 110% to your task. And then you don't have the energy for all of this, or you burn yourself out trying to. And that's not what gets you from middle management to C-suite. We have to go ahead and allocate how much. Is it going to be 30%? It's going to be, and the higher up you are, is the more you need to allocate your time towards learning this stuff. And we just focused not on putting more of her energy into this, as in going from 100 to 150% of her energy, depleting, burning herself out, into what are we allocate? What can you delegate? What doesn't need to be done right now? Because a lot of working class people are also doing way too fucking much, trying to do everything. You pull up the ladder behind you if nobody else gets an opportunity to do anything. I'm not saying exploit other people, but I am saying maybe dial back on the perfectionism and focus more on building those relationships, learning these unwritten rules, what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do, and how you're not going to perpetrate them behind you. And of course, all of this takes energy. I have another client, human resources management. She flagged a problem. She's also neurodivergent. So she told them respectfully but directly what the problem was, what she planned to do. They blew her off. Problem she warned about happened. The manager was distraught. She reminded them that she had brought this up. Oh, they didn't like that. They denied she'd said anything, and then they weren't too happy about it. So similar to with the other client, I worked with her on repackaging how she brings up issues and documenting what she does to make sure the backlash doesn't fall on her. I walked her through the class dynamics of the working class aren't supposed to have ideas. It's not that her ideas are bad, it's that having ideas at all were the problem. And we walked through my strategies on how you can approach this and document. And she absorbed it all. She saw the vision. I know what to do now. But God, this is another mask to put on. And that is the crux of it, friends. That's the crux of, she knows what to do and she will do it. And she can reallocate her energy. But I think that's what really, when we see studies like this show, a positive employee experience makes you more money. I can't help but wonder. And again, I wasn't in the Wellaba study, and it wasn't on my unwritten rules. I can't help but wonder, yeah, that's where the money's being lost. And the energy your employees are having to do in learning how to tiptoe around an ego. And that when problems are brought up, when they're seen as a threat and not a solution. Because the don't bring me problems, don't bring me solutions. Very often people also don't want you to bring solutions. Because of classism, because of how we have belittled the actual labor and upheld having an idea, even if you don't know how to execute it. And there is human costs to that, and there is business costs to that. And so when I see that companies that have better bottom-up communication, 56%, are doing better financially, I am not surprised. Because I see all the work that goes on the back end of just trying to solve a problem that people already know their solution to. They're just having to navigate and tiptoe around very easily threatened people. So here's what I want you to take from this video. If you've been told you're too direct, too blunt, too aggressive, which is different from if you're actually mean, I have a story about that. It's not just you, it is systemic. And for your survival, these are strategies you can learn. And sometimes organizations actually bring me in to give these workshops to their whole management on, I have one coming up where I'm going to walk them through a framework on how to bring up an idea with the unwritten rule of compliance in mind. But if you're higher up in an organization and you're seeing this and you have some influence, or maybe if you don't have influence right now, but you will one day because you learn how to do this, keep in mind that there is a dollar amount to the time. Keep in mind there is a dollar amount to the time that is wasted and the energy to doing things like this, to people just not being able to communicate and solve a problem. I'm not a believer in the saying of it's not business, it's personal. Everything overlaps. But it is very ironic for that phrase to be used so much, for them to have so much business negatively impacted by personal ego.